The heat was suffocating. Long before any iceberg, naval mine, or torpedo, Arthur John Priest's world was made of coal, steam, and fire. He didn't work on the elegant decks of great ocean liners. He didn't walk beneath crystal chandeliers. He didn't watch the open sea with the wind against his face. His world existed below the waterline, in the boiler rooms, in the furnaces, in the hot, dark heart of the ship. And from that metal and coal inferno, he survived an almost unbelievable of maritime disasters. The RMS Titanic, the HMHS Britannic, the SS Donegal, the RMS Alcantara, along with other serious collisions during his career. But this story doesn't begin with catastrophe. It begins with work. Arthur John Priest was born in England in 1887. He became a stoker, one of the hardest jobs in the age of steam. A stoker was responsible for feeding coal into the boilers. That meant grueling shifts in extreme heat, covered in soot, breathing heavy, dry air, shoveling continuously to maintain steam pressure. Without stokers, the great ships simply did not move. But they were rarely remembered. And it is precisely this position, invisible, underground, that makes his story so brutal. Because when a ship is struck, the danger begins exactly where he worked, below the waterline. In April 1912, Arthur Priest was aboard the Titanic as part of the boiler room crew. On the night of April 14th, when the ship collided with the iceberg, the stokers were among the first to realize something was wrong. Water began flooding the forward compartments. Even so, the work continued. Historical accounts indicate that engineers and stokers kept the boilers running long enough to maintain electrical power, allowing lights to stay on, pumps to operate, and distress signals to be sent. That mattered. It meant the Titanic did not immediately plunge into darkness. It meant there was time to launch lifeboats. But that time was bought at extreme risk to men like Arthur Priest. They remained in the most vulnerable areas as the water rose. At some point, orders were given to abandon the boiler rooms. And he climbed up. Not into luxury salons, but onto a slanted deck filled with controlled chaos and lowering lifeboats. Arthur Priest survived the Titanic. More than 1,500 did not. But his life at sea was far from over. After the Titanic, he returned to work. That alone says something. Many left maritime service after that disaster. He went back. During World War I, he was assigned to the HMHS Britannic, converted into a hospital ship. It was 1916. The setting was different from the Titanic. No luxury. When the Britannic struck a mine in the Aegean Sea, the explosion was violent. The ship sank in less than an hour. Once again, the lower compartments were among the most dangerous places to be. And once again, Arthur Priest was there. He escaped. He survived a second major sinking. But it still wasn't the end. He was also aboard the SS Donegal, a hospital ship torpedoed by a German submarine in 1917. The Donegal sank after the attack, resulting in casualties, but Priest survived yet again. And he was present during the engagement involving the RMS Alcantara, which fought the German auxiliary cruiser SMS Greif in 1916. The Alcantara was sunk after a fierce naval battle in the North Sea. Once more, Arthur Priest escaped. 4 confirmed sinkings. 2 additional serious collisions during his career. And he survived them all. But this sequence should not be viewed as mystical. It should be understood as the trajectory of a man who worked consistently on some of the largest ships of his era, in a time of war and extreme maritime risk. Still, the repetition was striking. So much so that, according to historical records, shipping companies eventually hesitated to hire him. Some colleagues believed he brought bad luck. He ultimately left the sea while still relatively young. But there is much more to examine. What does it mean to survive repeated shipwrecks? What was the real life of a stoker like? What does his story reveal about industrial naval warfare? And why do men like him so rarely stand at the center of historical narratives? If we want to truly understand Arthur John Priest's story, we need to go back down to where it all began, the boiler rooms. Deep inside the RMS Titanic, the air was nearly unbreathable. Work was divided into shifts, but the intensity never eased. Men covered in coal dust fed massive furnaces, maintaining the pressure that drove the ship's turbines and reciprocating engines. When the iceberg tore open the hull, water began flooding the forward compartments, dangerously close to the boiler rooms. The stokers never saw the iceberg. They didn't witness the maneuver on the bridge. What they felt was vibration, and then the unmistakable sense that something was wrong as watertight doors began closing. Even as water poured in, the work continued. That detail matters. The lights on the Titanic stayed on until just before the final collapse. That was only possible because men deep within the ship kept the boilers running as long as they could. They knew they were in the most vulnerable sections. And they stayed. Arthur Priest was one of them. When he finally made his way to the deck, he did not emerge as a celebrated hero. He emerged as part of an invisible crew, trying to find space in a lifeboat as the ship tilted beneath his feet. He survived. But the emotional cost of watching the ship disappear, knowing that colleagues had remained below, does not appear in official reports. After the Titanic, many crew members left the sea. Others returned quickly. Arthur went back. That alone reveals something about the mindset of maritime workers of the time. The sea was their livelihood. Trauma did not automatically mean a change of profession. Economic alternatives were limited. During World War I, he signed on to the HMHS Britannic, no longer a luxury liner but a hospital ship. The Britannic was larger than the Titanic and incorporated safety improvements. But it was sailing in a war zone. On November 21, 1916, it struck a mine in the Aegean Sea. The explosion was far more violent than the Titanic's collision. Water rushed in quickly. And once again the lower compartments became traps. Reports indicate that many stokers struggled to escape due to the speed of flooding. Arthur Priest made it out. It is difficult to imagine what must have gone through the mind of a man who, for the second time in 4 years, climbed from a flooding compartment to a slanted deck, listening to the sound of twisting metal. But he escaped. That same year he was aboard the RMS Alcantara, converted into an armed merchant cruiser. In February 1916, the Alcantara engaged the German auxiliary cruiser SMS Greif in the North Sea. The battle was fierce. Both ships were heavily damaged. The Alcantara eventually sank after the exchange of fire. Arthur was once again aboard a ship going down. And once again he survived. In 1917 he was serving on the SS Donegal, another hospital ship. The Donegal was torpedoed by a German submarine in the English Channel. The attack was direct. The ship sank. There were casualties. Arthur Priest was not among them. 4 confirmed major sinkings. In addition, he had been involved in earlier collisions during his career, including incidents connected to large liners like the RMS Olympic before the Titanic, along with other lesser accidents. The pattern began to draw attention among colleagues and employers. Some considered him unlucky. Others thought him extraordinarily fortunate. Shipping companies reportedly became hesitant to hire him, worried about reputation and superstition. This is a deeply human element of the story. It didn't matter that he was an experienced worker. The repeated disasters surrounding him created unease. And superstition carries weight at sea. But it is essential to avoid exaggeration. Arthur Priest was not the only survivor of these events. He did not escape alone while all others perished. He was part of large crews. His survival resulted from specific circumstances in each case. Still, surviving 4 confirmed sinkings and 2 serious collisions is statistically remarkable, especially given his position in the most dangerous sections of the ships. A question begins to emerge. What does it mean to survive repeatedly? The first time may be shock. The second, reinforced trauma. The third and fourth, perhaps a normalization of risk. How does a man keep boarding ships after seeing the ocean floor so many times? We have not yet reached the full psychological toll, nor how his maritime career ultimately came to an end. After the torpedoing of the SS Donegal in 1917, Arthur John Priest's reputation among British sailors had become unusual. It was not common to survive 1 major sinking. Surviving 2 was already rare. For began to seem almost unbelievable. But historical accuracy matters. He was not the only survivor of those ships. He did not escape alone while everyone else perished. In each case dozens, sometimes hundreds, survived. What makes his story remarkable is the repetition. He was present at separate disasters on different ships in completely different contexts, and he survived every time. And almost every time he escaped from below. Understanding the life of a stoker helps explain the constant danger. On steamships, the boiler rooms were located in the lower sections of the hull. In the event of a frontal collision, explosion, or torpedo strike, those areas were often the first to flood. Intense heat could quickly turn into a lethal trap when steam met incoming seawater. Stokers worked drenched in sweat, in poorly ventilated compartments on exhausting shifts. They had no view of the horizon. They did not know precisely what was happening on the bridge. When danger came, it came suddenly. On the RMS Titanic, water poured into the forward compartments. On the HMHS Britannic, a mine tore open the hull below the waterline. On the RMS Alcantara, shells ripped through the structure during combat. In every case, the engine and boiler spaces were among the most vulnerable areas. And that was where he worked. The battle involving the Alcantara in February 1916 was particularly violent. The British armed merchant cruiser engaged the German auxiliary cruiser Greif in the North Sea. There was intense gunfire. The Alcantara was repeatedly hit and eventually sank. Naval combat is not like striking an iceberg. There is fire, explosions, shell impacts, internal damage. Arthur survived again. Only months later he was aboard the Britannic. The rapid succession of events is striking. Combat in the North Sea, a mine in the Aegean, a torpedo in the English Channel. All within a relatively short span during a world war. Over time his reputation began to weigh on him. Historical accounts indicate that some shipping companies became reluctant to hire him. Not because he was incompetent. Not because he was undisciplined. But because of superstition. Sailors have long been deeply superstitious. Repeated disasters surrounding the same man created discomfort. He began to be viewed as someone who attracted bad luck, even though logically it was coincidence. This had practical consequences. Priest left the sea while still relatively young, around his early 30s. That detail matters. He did not retire due to age. He stepped away because opportunities diminished. His survival became a professional obstacle. There is deep irony in that. He survived extreme maritime disasters. But he did not survive the superstition of the maritime world. The war ended. The world changed. Shipping continued. But Arthur John Priest did not return to boiler rooms with the same regularity. He lived until 1937, dying relatively young at 49. He did not die at sea. He did not die in a disaster. He died on land. The contrast is powerful. After repeatedly escaping the ocean, his end came far from the waves. There is something almost symbolic in his trajectory. While names like Captain Edward Smith or naval commanders are remembered for strategic decisions, men like Arthur represent the industrial foundation of maritime warfare. They did not choose the routes. They kept the ships moving. Without stokers there is no steam. Without steam there is no speed. Without speed there is no crossing, and no combat. And yet they rarely stand at the center of the narrative. There is something that must be stated clearly about Arthur John Priest. He did not seek danger. Danger surrounded him because he worked at the backbone of steam navigation, the engine and boiler rooms. In an era when the world depended on massive coal-fired ships, stokers were essential. They maintained constant boiler pressure, fed furnaces with tons of coal per shift, and endured temperatures that could exceed 45 degrees Celsius, 113 degrees Fahrenheit, in enclosed spaces. It was brutal work. And in the event of disaster it was deadly work. On the RMS Titanic, the stokers were crucial in keeping the electrical power running while evacuation took place. That meant remaining at vulnerable stations while water advanced through the lower compartments. On the HMHS Britannic, the mine explosion caused rapid flooding in the lower sections. Many men had to fight their way out through steam, noise, and a sharply tilting deck. On the RMS Alcantara, shells pierced the hull during combat in the North Sea. And on the SS Donegal, a German torpedo struck the vessel directly, sending it down under active wartime conditions. 4 different contexts. 4 real sinkings. And in every one he escaped. But surviving repeatedly does not mean emerging emotionally untouched. Although there are no detailed records of his personal reflections, it is impossible to ignore the cumulative impact. Imagine climbing up to a slanted deck 4 separate times, smelling heated metal, hearing water rush into compartments, knowing colleagues remained below. On the Titanic, more than 1,500 died. On the Britannic, dozens perished, many in lifeboats pulled into spinning propellers. On the Donegal, patients and crew lost their lives. On the Alcantara, naval combat left dead on both sides. To survive repeatedly is also to carry repeated memory. And memory weighs heavily. There is a modern tendency to turn cases like his into near-supernatural legends. The unsinkable man, the cursed sailor, the invincible survivor. But the historical explanation is more sober. Arthur Priest worked on large vessels during a period of exceptionally high maritime risk, particularly during World War I. Large ships were strategic targets. Hospital ships, armed merchant cruisers and ocean liners were exposed to mines and torpedoes. He was not serving on quiet coastal ferries. He was operating in the main corridors of naval warfare. That statistically increased his exposure to danger. Still, the repetition is striking. And that repetition had concrete consequences. Shipping companies began to view him cautiously. Sailors have long been deeply superstitious. Stories circulate quickly among crews. Being present at 4 sinkings and 2 major collisions created discomfort. not because he was incompetent, but because the pattern felt unsettling. This eventually limited his opportunities. He left the sea earlier than many of his peers. There is bitter irony in that. He survived torpedoes, mines, and ice, but was pushed away by reputation. There is something deeply symbolic in his story. Men who worked in the depths of ships rarely received public recognition. When they survived, they were simply names on lists. When they died, they were numbers. Arthur Priest represents that invisible layer of industrial maritime history. He did not command guns. He did not walk grand saloons. He did not deliver speeches. He fed furnaces. And yet, he lived through some of the most dramatic maritime events of the early 20th century. There is also a broader reflection about the age of steam. The great ships of that era were technological marvels, but they depended on exhausting human labor. Every crossing required sweat, coal, and discipline. When those giants were struck, the men working below the waterline faced immediate danger. Arthur Priest faced that danger repeatedly. And repeatedly he escaped. There is an even deeper layer to Arthur John Priest's story that goes beyond a simple list of ships. It involves the very industrial system that sustained the British Empire in the early 20th century. The great steamships, such as the RMS Titanic, the HMHS Britannic, the RMS Alcantara, and the SS Donegal, were symbols of industrial power. But behind the elegance of their decks was an exhausting physical reality. Stokers worked shifts that could last up to 12 hours, feeding furnaces with tons of coal. The environment was dark, hot, and claustrophobic. With every shovel of coal thrown into the firebox, the ship advanced a few more meters across the ocean. It was invisible labor, but absolutely essential. When we speak of Priest surviving 4 shipwrecks, we must remember that he was always stationed in the most vulnerable sections. And that makes his repeated survival even more improbable. On the Titanic, watertight compartments slowed the sinking. But the flooding began in the lower sections. On the Britannic, the mine tore open a massive breach below the waterline. Flooding was rapid. On the Alcantara, combat in the North Sea repeatedly pierced the hull. On the Donegal, a German torpedo struck during active wartime conditions, leaving little margin for prolonged evacuation. In each of these episodes, the men in the engine and boiler rooms faced immediate danger long before many passengers fully understood what was happening. Arthur Priest was there. But there is something even more human about his trajectory. He did not become a celebrity. He did not publish widely circulated memoirs. He was not extensively interviewed as a historical figure during his lifetime. His notoriety came much later, when historians began noticing the extraordinary coincidence. That reinforces an essential point. He was not seeking narrative. He was seeking work. And that work repeatedly placed him in extreme circumstances. There is also a psychological dimension that is rarely quantified. Surviving once can cause profound trauma. Surviving repeatedly may create something different, a changed relationship with risk. Did he begin to see the sea with resignation? With indifference? With constant dread? We do not have detailed records of his private thoughts. But we know that he kept signing on. And that already says something. He did not leave the sea immediately after the Titanic. He did not leave after the Britannic. He did not leave after the Alcantara. Only when opportunities began to diminish, influenced by superstition and reputation, was his maritime career effectively shortened. And here lies a powerful irony. The man who survived again and again came to be viewed as a bearer of bad luck. Instead of being seen as a symbol of endurance, he became an object of unease. This reveals something about maritime culture of the time. Superstition and tradition coexisted with technology and steam. Ships were modern machines. But crews carried ancient beliefs. And beliefs can shape careers. Arthur Priest died in 1937 at the age of 49. It was not the sea that took him. After surviving ice, mines, torpedoes, and naval combat, his end came on land. That contrast closes his story in almost symbolic fashion. He escaped the ocean repeatedly. But he did not escape time. There is still an essential aspect to fully understanding Arthur John Priest's trajectory, the difference between visible heroism and silent survival. The great maritime disasters of the early 20th century tend to highlight captains, strategic decisions, and dramatic moments on deck. But what rarely occupies the center of the narrative is the effort of the men who worked below the waterline, men like Priest. On the RMS Titanic, the stokers kept power and lighting running until the final minutes. That was not a minor technical detail. It allowed lifeboats to be launched with some degree of order and distress signals to be transmitted. Those final minutes of light were purchased with extreme risk in the boiler rooms. Arthur was there. On the HMHS Britannic, the situation was even faster and more brutal. The mine explosion caused rapid flooding. Many men in the lower sections had little time to react. Survival there was not about extraordinary physical strength. It was about exact position, response time, and whether escape routes were still passable. He escaped again. In the engagement involving the RMS Alcantara, the danger came from shells piercing the hull. Naval combat brings a different psychological pressure than collision or mine. There is a clear awareness of human attack. Direct fire. Impact. And yet, Priest survived. In the torpedoing of the SS Donegal, the threat came invisibly from below the surface, typical of German submarine warfare. 4 distinct contexts. 4 confirmed sinkings. 2 additional serious collisions over the course of his career. And the same man passing through all of them. It is tempting to call this destiny. But historical explanation demands sobriety. He worked on large vessels during a period of extreme maritime risk, especially during the First World War when hospital ships and armed merchant cruisers were strategic targets. His exposure to danger was greater than that of coastal sailors or crews on smaller vessels. Even so, the repetition remains striking. Another rarely explored point is the cumulative effect of industrial risk. The age of steam depended on intense physical labor. Stokers frequently suffered respiratory problems, chronic fatigue, and premature physical wear. Arthur died at 49, relatively young. There is no record directly linking his death to the shipwrecks. But it is impossible to ignore that years spent in extreme heat, coal dust, and physical stress leave marks on the body. Surviving shipwrecks does not mean emerging untouched from the lifestyle. There is also the social dimension. He did not receive widely publicized medals. He did not become a celebrated public figure. His story gained attention decades later, when researchers began to notice the extraordinary pattern. This reveals something profound about historical memory. Focus tends to fall on leaders and high-command decisions. But the industrial base, the men in the boilers, the engines, the machinery, remains nearly invisible. Arthur Priest represents that base. Without stokers, the Titanic would have had no power. Without steam, the Britannic would not have sailed. Without constant pressure, armed merchant cruisers would not have entered combat. He was part of the human infrastructure of the industrial maritime age. There is something almost paradoxical about his trajectory. He passed through sinking ships again and again. Yet he was pushed aside not because of professional failure, but because of superstition. Companies hesitated to hire him. Sailors talked. And gradually the sea ceased to be his primary workplace. Not because of incapacity, but because of accumulated coincidence. That is perhaps the most human part of the story. Survival can inspire admiration, but it can also create discomfort. He was living proof that giant ships could sink, and perhaps that made his presence unsettling. There is still one crucial point that must be explored to truly understand Arthur John Priest's trajectory, the brutal normality of risk in that era. Today, when we look back and see the sequence, RMS Titanic, HMHS Britannic, RMS Alcantara, SS Donegal, it seems almost impossible that the same man was present at all of those events. But for a British stoker between 1912 and 1917, the world was defined by war, mines, torpedoes, and dangerous sea lanes. The North Atlantic was not a safe tourist route. The North Sea was an active combat zone. The Eastern Mediterranean was heavily mined. Large ships were strategic targets. Working on them meant accepting risk as part of the wage. And the wage was not high. Stokers were among the lowest paid workers aboard, considering the physical intensity of their job. They received little public recognition and rarely appeared in accounts of heroism. Yet they were indispensable. Without them, ships did not leave port. This creates a powerful contrast. The ships were celebrated as technological marvels. But they depended on men covered in coal dust, laboring in extreme heat. Arthur Priest represents that contradiction of the industrial age. There is also something almost mathematical about his survival. In each disaster, the number of survivors varied. On the Titanic, roughly 700 survived. On the Britannic, most of the crew escaped, though dozens died. On the Donegal and the Alcantara, there were also significant numbers of survivors. He was among them. He was not the only one. But repetition is what draws attention. And repetition has a collective psychological effect. When colleagues realize that one man has been aboard 4 ships that sank, coincidence becomes narrative. Narrative becomes superstition. Superstition becomes professional barrier. And so Arthur's maritime career was gradually shortened. There is also a broader historical dimension. Between 1912 and 1917, British maritime life underwent a brutal transition, from pre-war industrial optimism to total war. The Titanic symbolized industrial confidence. The Britannic symbolized adaptation to war. The Alcantara represented civilian conversion to armed combat. The Donegal symbolized the vulnerability even of hospital ships. Arthur stood at the intersection of all of it. He is almost a thread connecting the golden age of ocean liners to the brutality of submarine warfare. Another important reflection: the difference between luck and resilience. Luck may place you near a staircase that remains accessible when others are blocked. Resilience allows you to reach it in time. Surviving a shipwreck involves multiple variables: exact position, reaction time, ability to swim, weather conditions, proximity to lifeboats. Surviving repeatedly requires those variables to align in your favor more than once. That is not magic, but it is extraordinary. And there is still the silence surrounding men like him. He did not leave behind an extensive autobiography published in his lifetime. He did not become a public lecturer. He did not become a national symbol. His story emerged later, when researchers connected crew records and noticed the pattern. That reinforces something fundamental. History is often reconstructed from nearly forgotten names. Arthur John Priest could have remained just another stoker listed in archives. But the pattern of his life brought him back to the surface. There is one final structural layer we must explore to fully understand Arthur John Priest's trajectory: the relationship between individual survival and collective collapse. On every ship where he served, the RMS Titanic, the HMHS Britannic, the RMS Alcantara, and the SS Donegal, the pattern was the same. Massive systems failed. Steel structures designed to endure. Protocols created to prevent panic. Engineering meant to withstand impact. And yet each ship ended on the ocean floor. Arthur Priest survived not because the systems worked flawlessly, but because he managed to escape when they stopped working. That distinction matters. He was not a symbol of mechanical strength. He was a symbol of mechanical limits. On the Titanic, the myth of unsinkable was broken by ice. On the Britannic, structural improvements could not prevent a mine from tearing open the hull. On the Alcantara, firepower did not guarantee survival in naval combat. On the Donegal, even hospital ship status did not prevent a torpedo strike. Arthur was present when each of those systems revealed its boundaries. And he always began in the same place: the industrial guts of the ship. There is also something almost cruel in the irony of his story. First-class passengers from the Titanic are remembered by name, photographs, preserved belongings. Their stories are told and retold. Men like Arthur remain nearly anonymous. Yet they were the ones who kept the lights on until the final minutes. They fed the boilers that powered the pumps. They worked in the compartments where the water arrived first. And still they rarely appear in historical headlines. Arthur represents that invisible class of industrial maritime history. There is also the question of accumulated resilience. Surviving once may feel like a miracle. Surviving 4 times may create something different. Perhaps a resigned understanding that the sea is unpredictable. Perhaps he boarded ships after the Titanic with heightened caution. Perhaps not. We do not have detailed records of his private thoughts. What we do have are documented facts. He kept sailing until opportunities diminished. That reveals something simple and powerful. For many early 20th century workers, risk was part of the implicit contract of employment. The First World War magnified that risk dramatically. Between 1914 and 1918, German submarine warfare turned the Atlantic and the North Sea into lethal corridors. Mines were scattered along strategic routes. Civilian vessels were converted into armed ships. Arthur sailed in precisely that era. He did not cross oceans in stable peacetime. He crossed them in total war. That deepens the historical weight of his story. But there is something even more profound. Arthur John Priest is almost a condensed portrait of the steam age itself. Extreme physical labor. Technological confidence. Structural vulnerability. Industrialized warfare. Maritime superstition. Social invisibility. He moved through all of these forces in less than a decade. And he lived. But he did not escape reputation. In the end, superstition followed him more persistently than any torpedo. There is one final element that must be explored before closing Arthur John Priest's story: the cumulative impact of repetition. When we speak of him, it is easy to fall into the narrative of the luckiest man at sea. But the historical reality is more complex, and perhaps harsher. Surviving a shipwreck means witnessing the deaths of colleagues. On the RMS Titanic, more than 1,500 people died. Among them were engineers and stokers who remained at their posts until the very end. On the HMHS Britannic, dozens perished, some in lifeboats drawn into still-turning propellers. On the RMS Alcantara, naval combat in the North Sea left casualties on both sides. On the SS Donegal, a German torpedo killed patients and crew alike. Arthur escaped. But survival also means carrying memory. There is something deeply human about repeated exposure to danger. The first time may bring absolute shock. The second, disbelief. By the third and fourth, perhaps something else begins to form, less surprise, more quiet acceptance. We do not have detailed records of how he processed these experiences. But the fact that he continued sailing after the Titanic suggests that the sea did not become taboo for him. The danger did not disappear. It became normalized. That says a great deal about the mentality of maritime workers in that era. The sea was not romantic adventure. It was hard, dangerous, necessary work. It is also essential to understand that the ships on which he served were central to British industrial power. The Titanic symbolized technological supremacy. The Britannic symbolized adaptation to war. The Alcantara symbolized civilian mobilization for combat. The Donegal symbolized the vulnerability of even hospital ships. Arthur was present when each of these systems failed. He was a direct witness to the limits of steel. And perhaps the most striking part of his story is precisely this. He was not the architect of strategic decisions. He did not command ships. He did not design watertight compartments. But he stood at the exact point where the system met its breaking point, below the waterline, where water enters first, where heat becomes dangerous steam, where escape time is measured in minutes. He escaped 4 times. There is a final irony in his trajectory. Instead of being seen as a symbol of resilience, he became someone employers hesitated to hire because of superstition. It was not the sea that pushed him away. It was human perception of repeated coincidence. That reveals something fundamental about early 20th century maritime culture. Even in the height of the industrial age, old beliefs remained strong. Ships were modern machines. But their crews carried ancient fears. Arthur John Priest died in 1937 at the age of 49. His name does not appear on grand national monuments. Yet his story endures as a reminder of a generation of invisible workers who powered the steel giants and witnessed their fall. There is one final truth that must be confronted before closing Arthur John Priest's story: the brutal inequality of survival. When we speak of Priest, we speak of a man who survived 4 confirmed sinkings: the RMS Titanic, the HMHS Britannic, the RMS Alcantara, and the SS Donegal, in addition to serious collisions during his career. But survival is never democratic. On the Titanic, first-class passengers had faster access to upper decks. Stokers like Priest had to navigate lower corridors while water was already rising. On the Britannic, men in the boiler rooms had far less time to react than crew members already positioned near lifeboats. On the Alcantara, shells struck structural and internal compartments before many on deck even grasped the extent of the damage. In each case, physical location inside the ship directly influenced the odds of survival. Arthur always started from the most vulnerable point, and that makes his repeated survival all the more remarkable. But we must resist the temptation to turn this into a narrative of invincibility. He was not immortal. He was subject to the same variables as any other crew member. Exact position at the moment of impact, access to escape routes, reaction time, sea conditions. To survive 4 times means that in 4 separate contexts, those variables aligned in his favor. It was not a miracle. It was accumulated coincidence. Yet accumulated coincidence carries historical weight. There is also the physical dimension of his work, rarely discussed. Stokers inhaled coal dust daily. Extreme heat demanded constant physical output. The toll on the body was relentless. He died at 49, relatively young. There is no official record linking his death directly to the disasters or to boiler room labor. But it is impossible to ignore that industrial maritime life of that era was physically punishing. Surviving shipwrecks does not mean escaping invisible scars. There is a powerful contrast in his trajectory. The Titanic symbolized luxury and technological confidence. The Britannic represented medical adaptation in wartime. The Alcantara represented civilian conversion into naval combat. The Donegal represented the vulnerability of even vessels protected by humanitarian convention. Arthur was present in each of these phases. He did not merely survive disasters. He crossed the transition from the golden age of liners to the brutality of submarine warfare. His career is almost a condensed summary of the years 1912 to 1917. There is also something deeply human in the reaction of maritime companies. Instead of celebrating him as experienced and resilient, Some began to avoid hiring him. Superstition carries weight at sea. Repeated tragedy surrounding one name creates discomfort. He was not sidelined for incompetence. He was sidelined for coincidence. And that may be the bitterest part of the story. He faced ice, mines, and torpedoes and survived. But he lost ground to collective fear. And one final question remains. What does his story teach us about the relationship between man and machine? The great ships of that era were considered nearly unstoppable. Yet each revealed structural limits when confronted by nature or war. Arthur John Priest was a repeated witness to those limits. He was not a symbol of industrial power. He was proof of its vulnerability. In the end, Arthur John Priest's story is not simply about luck. It is about repetition. He descended into the depths of the RMS Titanic as just another anonymous stoker, feeding the furnaces that powered the largest ship in the world. When ice tore open the hull, the water rose first where he worked. Even so, the men in the boiler rooms kept the power running long enough for the ship to remain lit almost until the very end. He survived. 4 years later, he was aboard the HMHS Britannic. A mine exploded beneath the hull. Flooding was rapid. Lower compartments became traps. He escaped again. On the RMS Alcantara, he faced enemy fire in the North Sea. The ship sank after combat. He survived. On the SS Donegal, a torpedo ended yet another voyage. And once again he escaped. 4 confirmed sinkings. 2 major collisions over the course of his career. And always the same starting point, the bottom of the ship. Arthur was not a captain. Not a chief engineer. Not a figure in elegant deck photographs. He fed the furnaces. And yet he was present when some of the most emblematic ships of his generation revealed their limits. The Titanic shattered the myth of invincibility. The Britannic showed that structural improvements could not neutralize mines. The Alcantara proved that converted merchant ships were vulnerable in war. The Donegal demonstrated that not even hospital ships were immune. Arthur was a silent witness to that historic transition, from pre-war industrial confidence to the brutality of total war. But perhaps the most striking part of his trajectory is this. He survived the ships. But he did not escape superstition. Companies began to view him cautiously. Sailors whispered. Coincidence became reputation. And reputation limited opportunity. He left the sea while still young. There is something deeply human in that. The man who escaped ice, mines, and torpedoes was, in the end, pushed aside by invisible fear. He died in 1937 at the age of 49. He did not die at sea. After repeatedly confronting the ocean's depths, his end came on solid ground. And that closes his story in an almost symbolic way. Arthur John Priest's life reminds us of something essential about the age of the great steamships. The giants of steel were celebrated. But they depended on invisible men. When ships sank, headlines spoke of captains and notable passengers. Yet it was men in the boiler rooms who kept the lights burning until the final moments. Arthur represented that industrial foundation. He did not change the course of naval history. But he was there, repeatedly, when history split apart. He survived not through grand heroism, but through practical endurance, timing, and perhaps a rare measure of favorable coincidence. And in the silence of the engine rooms between coal and steam, he witnessed the end of an era.